Everyone gasped when Richard Caldwell walked into the gala. The city's most powerful had gathered under crystal chandeliers, expecting to see the woman they knew as his wife, a striking black woman whose presence could silence a room with grace alone. But instead, clinging nervously to his arm, was a young secretary with pale skin and an unsteady smile. The shift in the air was immediate. Conversations faltered, music seemed to dim, and the glances traded between glittering elites carried the kind of sharp judgment that even money could not drown. The whispers began as quickly as the champagne flowed. "Isn't his wife black?" one guest murmured, eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Where is she tonight?" another asked, lips curled with disdain. Richard heard it all, though he pretended not to. His jaw stiffened, his smile rehearsed. He told himself this was necessary, that bringing Lila, his wife of 12 years, would only invite ridicule, questions, and judgment. To Richard, image was everything. And in the cruelest corner of his heart, he had convinced himself that his wife's blackness was a liability. Yet the irony was cruel. Those who whispered didn't mock Lila. They pitied him. They saw the hollowness in his choice, the cowardice in replacing dignity with a cheap performance. Emily, the secretary, shifted uncomfortably at his side. She had accepted his invitation with excitement, foolishly believing it a sign of trust or affection. But now, under the scrutiny of eyes that pierced deeper than daggers, she understood her role. She was a stand-in, a mask to cover his shame. And no matter how dazzling her dress or how bright her smile, she could never hide the stench of betrayal that clung to Richard like cologne gone sour. Back at home, Lila stood by the window, the silence of the house pressing in like an unwelcome guest. She had known long before he left. She had read it in the way his eyes darted when people mentioned her, in the half-formed excuses about these events not being her scene. But this time was different. He had dressed carefully, sprayed his best cologne, and smiled with a nervousness that didn't belong to a man preparing for business. When he kissed her cheek, the emptiness of it told her everything. She didn't cry. Lila never cried. Instead, she walked to the piano, fingers trembling as they hovered over keys untouched for years. The melody that rose was fragile, a wounded hymn that spoke of promises broken and sacrifices forgotten. Every note carried the weight of nights spent supporting him, of years where she worked shifts too long and ate meals too small, all so Richard could build his empire. She remembered when he had nothing, when he was laughed at for dreaming too big. She remembered holding him in the dark, telling him he was enough, long before the world ever agreed. And yet, in the hour of his glory, he had cast her aside. At the gala, Richard was doing what he did best, performing. He laughed louder than necessary, clinked glasses with false charm, and introduced Emily as though she were some extension of himself. But beneath the veneer, sweat prickled his brow. Senator Wallace, a man whose approval Richard desperately sought, approached with his wife. The senator's eyes lingered not on Richard, but on Emily. His handshake was firm, his smile thin. "And this is?" Wallace asked pointedly. "My associate," Richard replied too quickly, then corrected, "My secretary, Emily." The senator's smile faltered. "Strange," he said, his tone deceptively mild. "I thought I'd had the honor of meeting your wife once. A remarkable woman, if I recall correctly. Why isn't she here tonight?" The words landed like a stone in Richard's chest. The hum of the room seemed to quiet again, as if every ear had tuned to the exchange. He stumbled over excuses. She wasn't feeling well. She doesn't enjoy these events, but each lie sounded thinner than the last. Wallace's wife exchanged a knowing glance, her lips tightening with disapproval. Richard felt exposed, naked under the chandeliers, his cowardice illuminated for all to see. Emily lowered her eyes, cheeks burning. She realized the humiliation wasn't hers, but his. He had not elevated himself by bringing her. He had diminished himself by betraying the woman everyone respected far more than him. The rest of the evening blurred into a haze of forced laughter and empty smiles. Richard felt the weight of stares follow him like shadows. Every handshake seemed weaker, every compliment tinged with mockery. He had come to the gala believing that leaving his black wife at home would open doors, but instead he found himself surrounded by walls closing in. At home, the melody on Lila's piano had shifted. No longer fragile, it rose with strength, as though her spirit refused to break under the insult. Mrs. Jennings, her elderly neighbor, knocked softly and stepped in with a plate of pie. She paused at the doorway, listening to the music. "You're not at the gala tonight?" she asked gently, though she already knew the answer. Lila offered a faint smile, never missing a note. Not tonight, she replied, her voice steady. Mrs. Jennings set the plate down, her eyes soft with sympathy. He's a fool if he doesn't see the jewel he has, she said simply, before slipping out again. Leela's fingers stilled on the keys, the silence that followed heavy with truth. She closed her eyes, not with tears but with resolve. She had endured humiliation before, but something inside her whispered that tonight marked a turning point. The tides of fate were shifting, and though Richard could not see it yet, his betrayal had set into motion a reckoning. As the gala drew to a close, Richard stepped outside into the cool night air, his chest tight with unease. Emily walked beside him, silent now, her earlier excitement extinguished. The chauffeur opened the door, and for the first time in years, Richard dreaded going home. He could feel it. Something was waiting for him. Not in anger or confrontation, but in the quiet dignity of a woman who no longer needed his validation. For fate has no patience with cowardice. It humbles the proud, exposes the weak, and lifts the silent strong. And Richard, though blind to it still, had just lost the only thing that gave his life meaning. He had not left his wife behind for the evening. He had left behind her trust, her pride, and the last thread of respect she still held for him. And once lost, such treasures do not return. The ride home from the gala was quiet. The car hummed down the empty streets, but inside the silence pressed like a storm. Emily sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, the glittering dress she'd chosen suddenly feeling cheap and heavy. She had dreamed of being admired, of being noticed, but all she had felt were eyes filled with disdain, not for her, but for the man beside her. Richard stared out the window, his jaw clenched. He could still hear Senator Wallace's words echoing in his head. Why isn't she here tonight? It wasn't the question itself that hurt. It was the look that followed. A look that stripped away every illusion he had carefully built. When the car stopped outside the house, Emily hesitated. Thank you for tonight, she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. Richard gave a curt nod. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. She was no longer a prop, not even an ally. She was a reminder of his failure. As she disappeared into the night, Richard walked into his home with heavy steps. The first thing he noticed was the piano. The sheet music was still open, a melody frozen mid-thought, as though the air itself had caught its breath. Lila wasn't in the room, but the faint light from upstairs told him she was awake. For a moment he considered going to her, offering some half-formed excuse, but pride kept his feet rooted. Instead, he poured himself a drink, the ice clinking against crystal in the silence. Upstairs, Lila lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She heard the clink of the glass, the familiar ritual of avoidance. She closed her eyes and thought, back to their early years, the nights. They stayed up dreaming about a life beyond rent. Notices and overdue bills, the nights he swore he would make her proud. And she wondered, what had changed? Was it the money? The power? Or had the seed of shame always been there, waiting for the right soil to grow? The following morning, Richard expected to bury the shame under routine. He dressed for work with mechanical precision, as though his tie could strangle last night's humiliation into silence. But when he arrived at the office, whispers met him at the door. His staff tried to appear busy, but their sideways glances betrayed the gossip already circulating. Emily avoided his gaze, her face pale with regret. He realized with a sinking heart that word of the gala had spread faster than wildfire. At lunch, a colleague sat across from him with a smirk. Heard you brought your secretary instead of your wife, he said casually. But his tone dripped with accusation. Bold move, Richard. Richard forced a laugh, but his hand tightened around his fork. The colleague leaned in, lowering his voice. Careful. People notice things like that, especially people who matter. The words haunted him all day. By evening, Richard found himself staring at his reflection in the office window, the city lights flickering behind him. The face staring back was not the powerful man he imagined, but a hollow figure desperately holding together a crumbling facade. At home, Lila prepared dinner as she always did, her movements calm, her silence louder than any confrontation. Richard sat across from her at the table, the clatter of silverware filling the void between them. Finally, he spoke. About last night, he began, his voice strained. It was complicated. These events, they're political. I didn't want you to feel uncomfortable. Lila looked up slowly, her gaze steady. Uncomfortable? She repeated softly. You think I haven't been stared at before? Whispered about? I've lived my whole life walking into rooms where I wasn't welcome. The difference is, I never needed their approval to know my worth. Her words cut sharper than any argument. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't argue with her truth. Instead, he retreated to silence, ashamed not of the whispers, but of himself. Days passed, but the shadows of the gala lingered. At work, deals slipped through his fingers. Meetings ended with polite smiles, but no promises. The senator, once eager to align with him, canceled an appointment without explanation. Richard realized with growing dread that his cowardice hadn't bought him acceptance. It had cost him respect. Meanwhile, Lila carried herself with quiet dignity. She went about her days as though untouched by his betrayal. But inside, something was shifting. She no longer sought his attention, no longer softened her steps to ease his moods. She poured her energy into her art, into the piano, into the small community projects she had always loved but never had time for. Neighbors admired her. Friends sought her counsel, and slowly, Lila began to see her life as something more than the shadow of Richard's ambition. One evening, while attending a neighborhood fundraiser, Lila was approached by none other than Senator Wallace's wife. The senator's family had long been involved in community work, and his wife had heard of Lila's quiet efforts. She introduced herself warmly, praising Lila's dedication. "It's rare," she said, "to see someone with such grace. Your presence alone commands respect." Lila thanked her politely, though inside her heart ached with irony. The very circles Richard had tried to enter by denying her were now opening to her directly, not because of his wealth, but because of her authenticity. When Richard heard about the encounter days later, something inside him snapped. "You went to the senator's fundraiser?" he asked sharply. "Yes," Lila replied evenly. "His wife invited me." Richard's hands curled into fists. "Do you have any idea how that looks? Me struggling to hold deals together while I what?" Lila interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "While I live my life with honesty? While I refuse to be hidden because of the color of my skin? If you're struggling, Richard, it's not because of me. It's because the world finally saw you for what you are." Her words struck like lightning. Richard felt anger, shame, fear, all colliding at once. He wanted to shout, to defend himself, but deep down he knew she was right. His downfall wasn't Lila's doing. It was his own. That night, as he lay awake, Richard stared into the dark and wondered when he had lost himself. He had chased the world's approval, only to find himself abandoned by it. And in the process, he had betrayed the only person who had ever truly believed in him. But fate was not finished. The tables had only begun to turn. For in the days to come, Richard would face a choice: cling to his pride and lose everything, or confront the truth and risk the humiliation of redemption. And it was Lila, not Richard, who would decide whether his story ended in ruin or in grace. The days after the senator's fundraiser were like slow poison for Richard Caldwell. Once the darling of business circles, he now found himself shut out of meetings, his calls unanswered, his deals collapsing one after another. The very people whose approval he had sought so desperately no longer cared to be in his company. What remained was a hollow man pacing empty offices, his empire trembling on foundations of sand. At home, silence had grown into something permanent. Lila no longer waited up for him, no longer asked about his day. She existed in her own orbit, her piano filling the nights with melodies that were not for him. The house felt less like a home and more like a courtroom, each note from her hands a quiet verdict against him. One evening, Richard returned late, his tie loosened, his face weary. As he entered, he heard voices in the living room. Lila was hosting neighbors, members of the community who had come to discuss a charity drive she was leading. They laughed with her, admired her vision, and listened intently as she spoke with a confidence that made her seem larger than life. For the first time, Richard realized something startling. They respected her in ways they had never respected him. When the guests left, Richard lingered in the doorway. "You've been busy," he said, the words carrying a bitterness he couldn't mask. Lila looked at him calmly. "Yes, I've been building something that matters." Her tone was not cruel, but it stripped him bare nonetheless. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no words, because deep down he knew she had already surpassed him in every way that counted. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. A board meeting was called at Richard's firm, a meeting he assumed was routine. But as he entered the sleek conference room, he noticed the mood was different. His colleagues avoided his eyes, their expressions cold, resolute. At the head of the table, the chairman cleared his throat. "Richard," he began, his voice formal, "we've reviewed recent events and their impact on the company's reputation. Your actions at the gala and the fallout since have..." damaged our credibility with key partners. Effective immediately, we are relieving you of your position. The words crashed over him like a tidal wave. He tried to argue, to explain, but the chairman raised a hand. It isn't just the gala, Richard. It's what it revealed. Leadership is about integrity, about standing firm even when others don't. And what we saw was not a leader, but a man ashamed of his own family. The finality of it hit him harder than he expected. For years he had believed wealth and power made him untouchable. But now he stood exposed, stripped of everything he thought defined him. That night he returned home to find Lila at the piano, her back to him, her music filling the room with a haunting grace. He stood in the doorway, his hands trembling, the weight of his failure pressing down. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be honest. I lost it all, he confessed, his voice hoarse. The company, the respect, everything. They said I wasn't fit to lead. Lila's fingers stilled on the keys, but she did not turn. Silence stretched between them until finally she spoke. You didn't lose it tonight, Richard. You lost it the moment you decided I wasn't enough. The moment you chose shame over love. Her words pierced him deeper than any boardroom dismissal. He stepped closer, desperation in his voice. Lila, I was wrong. I was a coward. I thought I needed their approval, but I see now. None of it mattered. You're the only one who ever believed in me, the only one who ever stood by me, and I threw it away. At last she turned to face him. Her eyes held no anger, only a weary kind of truth. You didn't throw it away, Richard. You gave it away, piece by piece, every time you chose their opinion over our bond. I can't keep giving myself to a man who doesn't see my worth. His knees buckled, and for the first time in years, Richard wept. Not the tears of a man seeking pity, but the raw sobs of someone finally confronting the truth of his own brokenness. Lila stood, her posture regal, her dignity unshaken. I spent years carrying your dreams, building you up when no one else believed. Now it's my turn to live without carrying your shame. Her words were final, and Richard knew it. He had expected anger, maybe even forgiveness. But not this, the quiet strength of a woman reclaiming herself. It was then he realized the cruel twist of fate. He had abandoned her for the approval of strangers, and in the end, he was left with nothing but their scorn. Weeks passed, and the city began to whisper a new story. Not of Richard Caldwell, the fallen businessman, but of Lila Caldwell, the woman who rose from the shadow of betrayal to lead with grace. She became a voice in the community, her charity work gaining recognition, her music stirring hearts. The very circles Richard had longed to enter now embraced her, not for her wealth, but for her authenticity. Richard, meanwhile, faded from the spotlight. He lived quietly, haunted by the memory of the woman he had once held, but never truly valued. He saw her name in the papers, her face in photographs, her laughter at events he was no longer invited to. And every time, he felt the same sting, the realization that he had traded gold for dust. But Lila never looked back. She had carried his shame long enough. Now she carried only her own pride, her own dignity, her own future. And so the tables turned. The man who had been ashamed of his black wife became the man, defined by his own disgrace. And the woman he had tried to hide became the light others looked to with admiration.